It begins with death, as so many stories do. Not a clean, singular ending, but the sprawling, chaotic death of an entire city. The kind that unravels the fabric of daily life one thread at a time, until the living are outnumbered by the dead, or only the barely living remain. Bangkok, the city of angels, folded in on itself under the weight of unburied bodies. Cholera, they called it, a disease that arrived quietly, like a thief in the night, then announced itself in shrieks and fevers and torrents of vomit. But disease is just a word. It was death itself that took hold of the city and made it its own, twisting even holy places into something unholy. Wat Saket, with its shining golden stupa, stood atop the hill like a beacon of salvation. Or at least, it was supposed to. In a time when salvation seemed as improbable as rain in the desert, and escape was no longer a right, but a luxury, the temple grounds transformed from a sanctuary to a charnel house. The bodies piled up faster than the monks could chant blessings, faster than gravediggers could carve out pits, faster than anyone could count. Corpses, men, women, children, were stacked like firewood, then shoveled into mass graves until there was no more ground to bury. Then came the vultures. At first, they appeared as specks against the sky, but soon they descended in great dark flocks, blotting out the sun. A living tide of black feathers and hooked beaks tearing apart what remained of the city's dignity. By noon, their shadows draped over Bangkok streets, a moving shroud that made the living lower their heads and avert their gaze. Wat Saket, once a place of worship, became their kingdom. The vultures perched on rooftops, temple gates, even the thin branches of the frangipani trees that bent under their weight. Their cries filled the air, a terrible cacophony of hunger and greed as they tore into the flesh of the unburied dead. You could hear them even from the riverbanks, the endless snapping and rustling of wings. And so the temple turned into a feast for death's courtiers, and the city looked away, pretended not to see, but some sights linger no matter how hard you try to forget them. The image of human remains torn apart, bones picked clean by birds, became a new and bitter reality, seared into the memory of those who survived. The Vultures of Wat Saket, they called them. It became a whispered truth, a scar that would never quite fade. But the dead have a way of clinging on, of refusing to be completely devoured. Some of them found refuge a short walk away at Wat Suthat, a quieter, darker temple where death seemed less physical, more ethereal. If Wat Saket was where the bodies were consumed, then Wat Suthat was where the souls gathered, crowding in the dim, incense-filled hallways like exiles at the edge of some forgotten world. They were called pretas, not quite ghosts, something more pitiful, more cursed. Creatures grotesquely tall and thin, their mouths reduced to narrow slits that could neither speak nor swallow. Eyes sunken and desperate, hands stretched forever towards something they could never reach. In the misty mornings, people swore they saw them flickering at the edges of the temple grounds, their thin fingers brushing the temple columns, always reaching for some unattainable release. The giant swing outside Wat Suthat stood as a monument to a time when the line between living and dead was not so blurred. Its long shadow fell across the temple grounds as if it too tried to ward off the restless spirits. And the people who passed by knew better than to linger, for the stories of the ghosts of Wat Suthat were woven into Bangkok's very fabric. Some said they were the spirits of liars, thieves, those who had betrayed their families and gods. But in a cholera epidemic, who could claim to know who was wicked and who was not? So the pretas gathered, not as punishment, but as testimony. To what? No one knew. To hunger, perhaps, to sorrow, to the strange, unyielding will to remain when the world itself had turned its back. The vultures of Wat Saket, the ghosts of Wat Suthat, they linger in the minds of the old men who survived the plague, in the whispers of children who swear they see shadows moving where no shadows should be. They are part of the temples now, woven into the bricks and stones as surely as the carvings of Buddhas and mythic beasts. Even if the city scrubs the bloodstains from its stones, tears down old buildings and builds new ones, the stories cling on, stubborn as mold, because they are more than stories. They are warnings, reminders, proof that the dead don't always go quietly. What can remain when death comes not as a thief, but as a conqueror? Fear, perhaps? Unease. The feeling that something unseen watches from the edges of sight. The metallic smell of decay. The rustling sound of wings. And the question that lingers long after the story is told. Is it just a tale? Or is it a truth too terrible to forget? The vultures, the ghosts, not threats, not curses, just acknowledgements of what we cannot escape, of what we do not want to remember, yet cannot bear to let go.